Hello and welcome back. My name is Vilas and you're watching Selenium Express. And in this video, we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic. So when it comes to Spring Boot, and if I'm going to be asking you to do an integration with any database, then what are the tech stack you're going to be using? Maybe the very specific answer will be, Vilas, I have the Spring Data module, and under Spring Data, there are a lot of different modules or approaches we have. Like we can connect to the database using Spring Data JDBC, by using the Spring Data JPA, by using the Spring Data Mongo. If you're connecting to a Mongo database, we have a lot of approaches to connect to the database. But if I'm going to be specifically asking you like what are the steps that you'll be following to connect to any database, then maybe the most frequent answer will be, Vilas, add these three properties and things will be sorted. You don't have to do anything else. Spring Boot has auto configuration feature and all the magic will happen behind the scene and you just be relaxed. So things will go sorted, right? Now here, if we will go a step ahead and if someone will ask you that, okay, when you add that three properties, what basically happens behind the scene? What if I'll tell you, don't use Spring Boot and create some application where I will add those three properties and your application should be able to connect to the database and should allow me to do some operation using any API. Then can we afford to write that kind of an application? Or at least we should know when we add those three properties, what basically happens behind the scene? What are the components which gets auto-configured by Spring Boot? It's very important to know about it because that's going to matter a lot in a lot of time. So in this video, we're going to be going internal. And we're going to be having a deep dive how the Spring Boot and database integration happens. Now, we will take any common example. Let's say we're going to be picking Spring JDBC module for today, Spring Boot JDBC by the way, and we will see how the data sources get auto-configured, how this JDBC template gets auto-configured, how a connection pool gets created. What do you mean by a connection pool? What is the connection pooling concept? What are the different vendors we have? How can we integrate them using the Spring Boot application? And in the end of the video, we will go a step ahead. Once we understand all these things, we're going to be seeing like how all these things happens by Spring Boot magically behind the scene using the auto configuration feature. So this video, you can use it to learn depth about what happens behind the scene when it comes to the Spring Boot and database integration using Spring JDBC, and also how the Spring Boot auto configuration works. So if you are only here for the internal part, then you can go to this timestamp and can just learn how Spring Boot auto configuration feature works and how the integration happens. But if you're a beginner, I'll strongly recommend you to watch right from the scratch, go a step by step, take baby step, because I have a lot of time. You should be able to afford time to watch this video, right? Go step by step only. Do not rush. At Selenium Express, we don't rush, at least. I'll see you guys in the video and just watch it. Okay then, so first of all, let's just go to start.spring.io and let's just download our Spring Basic Template project. So I'm already inside the Spring Initializer website. I have chosen all my details like the project details, the build tool I'll be using Maven, language Java, Spring Boot version is the latest 3.1.5. These are my project metadata like the project name and the packages and everything. I have the packaging type as jar and the Java version I'll be using 17. You are free to use any of the versions. And the dependencies, here comes the most important thing. So I'll be creating a simple JDBC project. So I'll be using Spring Boot JDBC. So I'll be writing JDBC. So I'll be choosing this JDBC API right over here. And this is going to allow me the feature for the database connectivity. Okay. Another dependency I'll be using, I want to use the MySQL database right now. So I'll go for MySQL driver and that's it. That's what I need. And with this, I'll do all my experiments right now. So if I'll go to this explore right now, let's just check the dependencies that we have added. Perfect. So here goes the dependency. So we have the Spring Boot starter JDBC, which looks good. And also we have the MySQL connector J, which is the MySQL driver. And this is all that I am interested for right now. So I'm going to close this tab and download this project called Spring Data JDBC Internals. So click on generate the project. I want to save it as like this only, do a save. It will be saved. So I'll open up my IntelliJ and I'm going to drag my Spring Data JDBC internal project and I'll leave it inside my IntelliJ, and I am ready to start the development process. Okay, first of all, let's just do a very simple work and then we will try to go in depth. Let's just try to develop a very simple project with Spring Boot, which is going to push a record to our database which exists inside the MySQL. Let's say here I have my MySQL database, and if I'll go to my MySQL, so here I want to drag your attention to one of my table. Here we have a table called student. I just want to push some data to this particular table. So how to do it with Spring JDBC? It's going to be very simple. Let's just see how will we set it up first, and then we'll start asking a lot of questions. Why this is happening, how this is happening, what is the internals which is going on over here behind the scene, and we'll try to have a deep dive. So first of all, let's just push some records inside the student table. First of all, I'll go to my IntelliJ, and right here, what should I do first to connect to that particular database that I have in MySQL? So the first thing that I'll be doing, I'll be going into my source main resources folder, and basically I want to connect to that particular database. So I want to create a connection, and if I want to create a connection, then I don't have to do anything in Spring Boot. I just have to place 3 different properties in my Spring Boot, and you guys already know about this. Okay, so what are those properties? It's going to be spring.datasource.username. Let's say my username is root. Another one is spring.datasource.password. It's going to be Avilas in my case. And another one, spring.datasource.url. Okay, and in my case, my MySQL URL will be copy the JDBC connection string, come to IntelliJ and paste it inside like this. So this is going to be the URL, and I want to connect to the database, which name is, let's just go inside this. And I want to connect to this database called cell.exp test, right? Let me make it my default database for now. Okay, so that it will be in bold in color. So I want to insert data to this table, which is there inside this database. So cell.exp test is my database name. So let me put it over here, cell.exp_test. There you go. I am done. Now with this much of information, Spring Boot will do all the configuration behind the scene, and this is our main intention, like what are the configuration it is going to do behind the scene, but we'll come back to that. So I think with this, we are good to go, right? So what I can do, I can go to my source main Java folder, and now inside this, let me just open this off, this particular file. And inside this, let's say I want to do some operation so that I can push one record to my student table in my database. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to be utilizing Spring JDBC to insert data to the database. So I'll be using some Spring JDBC method. So I'll be writing my code inside a code block, and for that I'm going to be implementing my main class with command line runner. And right over here, I will override the run method. Okay. Okay, so right now this run method will be automatically called by Spring Boot whenever Spring Boot bootstraps, and whatever code I'll be writing inside this, all this code will be invoked. So right now the code that I want to write, that's going to be like, inserting a record to the student table. And this is what I'm going to be doing right now. So to do this, I'm going to take the help of a API class that the Spring Boot provides me, and that's called JdbcTemplate, because I want to do some operation, some insert operation. So I'll be take help of this API, and I really don't have to create the object for this. I just want to use it. So I will just write auto word. That's it, because Spring Boot will create the object of JDBcTemplate. How? Yeah, that's the thing we'll be exploring later. But by now, I think you guys know Spring Boot does a lot of auto configuration magic, and that will happen behind the scene, and Spring Boot will create the object of JDBC template, and I'll be just using it. That's very simple. We don't have to worry about it, how it is getting created behind the scene. Well, we'll be coming back to that anyhow. So I'll copy this JDBC template right now, and I'll be using one of the methods, let's say execute method I want to use, and this is going to take a string. So I'm going to be writing a SQL string here. Let's say insert into, and my table name. My table name here is called student. So let's just use this one. So insert into student, and I'm going to be using the values, and these are going to be the values. So the columns that I have inside this are the ID and one second. Okay, I think I have to format this table a little bit. So I think I do not want this primary column should be ID, right? And this ID I do not need. I can delete the selected. I have three columns: ID, name, and country, right? These are the three records that I have. Do apply and do some modification. Do a close, and this is the table that I have: ID, name, and country. So we need to insert data to this table. So let's just write an insert query. So I want to insert 1 as a primary key. Then name, let's say the student name is Vilas. And then, okay, this should be inside the single quote, not inside the double quote, like this. And the next thing that I want to insert is the country. Let's say Vilas is from India, and this is going to be a string. So I'm going to be writing it inside the single quote, and that's it. So this is my execute, and I think with this I'm done. It's so simple in Spring Boot, isn't it? Within 10 minutes, we developed an application which is going to insert data to a table, and this is very fancy because when we started learning Java, in my days at least, this was not this simple, trust me. But let's see if it is running right now. Let's just try to run my main method, and when my main method will execute, after the main method execution is complete, then this method will be automatically called by Spring Boot because this is a callback method, and then this particular code will be invoked. And I just want to write one thing: sout data inserted, right? Data inserted to the table. There we go. Do a Control S and run this. Okay, let's just see our console. Okay, there is an issue over here. What is this? URL must be start with JDBC. Okay, so I think my URL is not working fine. Let's just go to the application.properties, JDBC Spring data source URL. Oh, sorry. I think I don't have to give it inside the double quote. I'm sorry about it. Mistakenly, I put it inside the double quote. So remove the double quote. And there we go. So we are done, right? Let's just rerun our program one more time, and let's just see if our data has been inserted. And I think it is doing it. Now you can see this log, data inserted to the table. So if I'm gonna go to my table, if I'm gonna run this particular program, yeah, it is inserted. ID 1, name Vilas, and the country is India. So working good. So Spring Boot has done all the fancy stuff behind the scene, and it has done a lot of different things. I can see that it is starting some Hikari connection pooling. We'll understand what it is. We can see there is some connection implementation of JDBC, this particular object, one connection it is creating for me. And then it is also helping me to insert the data to the table. So we as a developer have not done any kind of configuration. We just have to call this execute method, pass in our SQL string, and that's it. It's very simple. But yeah, so let's just start understanding the things right now in a little in depth right now. But before that, I just want to do one thing. This console doesn't look good to me because there is no coloring over here. I just want to activate some ANSI coloring so that my console will look good at least. So I think I'll just write spring.ANSI.enabled. I think this is the properties. Let's just see if that works. If I'm gonna run this, is my console is looking a little better? No, not at all. This error is coming for a different reason, because this error is coming because right now if I want to insert another data, I have to change the primary key. If you're not going to change the primary key, you're going to be getting an exception called duplicate entry 1 for the key primary. So we already have a student available with a Vilas with same primary key. So let's say I'm going to change it to another student. Now this should work fine. But my goal is not that. I just want to see all my logs in a better way in my IntelliJ console. Right now you can see that the things are working good and the data is inserted to the table, of course. But I think, but what is that property? Let me just search in internet a little bit. Oh, there goes the properties. Okay, let me have it. Can I copy this property? Control C, come over here, and this one I'm gonna paste it over here. Okay, I'm going to be restarting my application. Okay, now I can see the caller. Again, the error is coming for a different region because we already have an entry available for that particular record. But look at my console right now. It looks a little colorful, isn't it? I just want this color because this is good to my eyes, at least just to see the infos. And I can see all my logs right now, that one Hikari pool that Spring is creating behind the scene and is starting my connection pooling and all these things that we're going to be exploring right now. So let's just get started right now. I think we are all set to go with this much of information. Let's just go in depth right now. Okay, so now let's think what is happening behind the scene. Okay, what we have done so far, we have added 3 properties. These are the 3 major properties that we have added. This is just for our that color change thing. We can ignore it right now. But these are the main 3 properties. What these properties are doing, maybe Spring is reading all this property, and out of these properties, it is creating a connection to my database, right? You know that here we are making a call. Let's say we're doing JDBC template and execute. So JDBC template is helping me to push one record to the database by executing this command on my database. But to execute this command, my JDBC template need to connect to the database, right? And to connect to the database, the JDBC template should need the connection details that, okay, if I want to connect to this MySQL database, then I should know this database name. I should know this database connection details, like the username is root, it is available in this localhost, and every details it does need. And we have provided all the details right over here using this, right? This is our connection URL that it is. This is where the MySQL is running in the localhost. This is the port number where the SQL server or the MySQL is running, and this is the database that you want to connect to. All these details has been read behind the scene, right? And out of that, a connection is getting created. And the connection object in Java basically wraps up, like the connection object in Java comes under or being wrapped off an object called data source. So when we say data source in Java or in Spring Boot is basically the connection information. Now, if you're going to see here, if I'm going to come to my main application. So in Java, they said the JDBC template, if it wants to connect to the database, it will be needing the connection detail or it will be needing the data source. So if you're going to come over here and write something called data source coming from javax.sql, and if you're going to write data source, I am sure that the JDBC template is connecting to the database, mean it is having the connection details and connection object, and that connection object is already been created by data source. So data source object is also getting created by Spring behind the scene because we're using Spring Boot. So I'm sure if I'm going to be writing at AutoWord, I'll be having access to that object that Spring is creating for me, the data source object. Now, if I'm going to print it over here, let's just print this object right now. If you're going to do s out, okay, and if I'm going to be printing my data source object, then let's just see if I'm able to print it, right? So if I'm going to be running my application one more time, okay, the primary key need to be changed, otherwise I'll be getting an exception. I feel the same duplicate entry for number 2. Let me add number 3 here and let me just run this. Now I think I'll be able to print the data source information. Let's just see that. Okay, there you go. Look at this particular s out. It is Hikari data source. That means Spring Boot is creating a connection for me, a connection for the application, so that my Spring Boot application will connect to the MySQL database, and that connection is created through Hikari data source, and that is also being configured, by Spring Boot. This AutoWare is happening because the data source object is created by Spring Boot, right? Okay, so let's say I really want to understand what is happening behind the scene, because if the data source object is getting created, JDBcTemplate object is getting created, it should be created through some auto configuration, right? And we know Spring Boot is popular for auto configuration because all this object creation is not done by the developer. Spring Boot knows that, okay, if somebody wants to use the execute method, he should be using the JDBC template and he should be creating the JDBC template object. So why to give him the responsibility of creating the JDBC template object? I will create it for the programmer, okay? But let's say right now I'm here to learn. I just want to see how all those stuffs are happening. So I will be showing you how Spring Boot is doing it in some time. But just remember, there are two auto configuration classes which is being used by Spring Boot, and Spring Boot is using those auto configuration classes to configure the JDBC template object and the data source object. Let's just let's just turn it off. Let's just turn off the auto configuration and let's just see what is going to happen. So if I'm going to come over here and if I'm going to write exclude, let's say there is an auto configuration, I want to turn it off, called JDBC Autoconfiguration, because I know that Spring is using it behind the scene, JDBcTemplateAutoConfiguration.class. And also I want this data source autoconfiguration also I want to create. I do not want Spring to create, okay? Because Spring is creating some connection object, Hikari data source, some Hikari connection object it is creating. I'll tell you about Hikari, what it is. But yeah, some connection object is getting created, what we can see over here. I just want to turn that auto configuration right now as well. So there is a class called data source auto configuration. Can I just try that? Data source. I'm not able to write it because I'm writing two class names, so I have to put it inside the inside an array, because two classes I want to turn it off. So can I just write right now data source auto configuration, right? This one, and I'm gonna write dot class. And obviously right now, if I'm gonna be running this application, it will fail. Right now I'm going to be getting some null exception, and you can see that it's already failing, and it is saying that field for JDBC template in this class there is a required bin type of JDBC template that could not be found, and it is asking me to do the dependency injection for the auto wearing, and it is asking me to consider defining a bean called JDBC template in your configuration. It is saying that, okay, previously I used to create the JDBC template object and I used to give you the object whenever you used to say AutoWare, but right now I don't have that object. Can you please try defining the JDBC template bean in your configuration file? Of course, I'll be doing that. So let me just go to the project and let me just try to do all these things by myself first, and then I can understand how to configure JDBC template and data source and the connection pulling by myself. Then I will go to the detailing of Spring Boot, how it is doing it, then I can understand it better, right? So first of all, I just turn off all the auto configuration feature so that I have to create this couple of objects in order to make the auto wearing happen, right? So I'll be coming to here and I will be creating a Java class, and I'll be just saying, well, let's say, app config or something like that. And obviously I'll be doing a lot of configuration over here. So I'll be creating a configuration. So I'll be just writing configuration, and it is asking me to create a JDBC template object in my configuration so that it can auto wear it. Okay, cool. I'll be creating a JDBC template object. I'm going to be writing public JDBC template because this object I want to create and return. And let's say JDBC template, and I'll be creating a JDBC template object. So JDBC template is equal to new JDBC template, and I can return a JDBC template object over here. So yeah, you want the JDBC template object, I have created it, and you want a bean, I have created this bean. So you can use this bean right now, and this bean right now can be happily injected over here okay, over here on this object, right? So now I can use the JDBC template object right over here and can invoke the execute method because I have created this particular object. Let's see what is going to happen behind the scene right now. Let's just run this application one more time. So right now again we are having a problem, and what is that problem right now? And you can see it is just saying property data source is required. It is saying okay, you have defined the JDBC template object, so you can make operation, you can make insert, you can execute insert statement. But in order to run this statement in the database, JDBC template need a data source or need a connection object to connect to the database first. Then only it can run this particular statement. And for that, it is requiring a property called data source. So if you're going to go and scroll up a little bit, you're going to be finding some much detailed explanation. Error creating the Spring JDBC internal application, maybe some unsatisfied dependency expressed to the JDBC template, because I think internally JDBC template there is a property data source is required. So I think what is happening, guys, if you're going to go to this JDBC template, inside this JDBC template, if I'm going to click on this, inside this JDBC template, there is a property called data source. That data source object we are not giving to JDBC template. But if you're going to see all the properties here, we do not see any data source property because the data source property is inside this class, which is extended by the JDBC template. So if you're going to go inside this, here we have the data source property, right? So this property we have to set. That means the JDBC template class that you are seeing, internally it needs the data source object to connect to the database first, and then it can use the execute method to run any SQL query. So how can we set the data source object that is inside this particular class extended by the JDBC template? So you can see the JDBC template, we are right now using this constructor to create our JDBC template object. So obviously if we'll go to the app config class, we are creating the object like this using this constructor. But we do have another constructor. If you're going to go to the JDBC template class one more time, this constructor we can use, and here we can pass a data source object, and this data source object can be set by the set data source method. You can just click on set data source. You can see it is asking for the data source and setting it with this particular class variable, and obviously this class is extended by the JDBC template. So I got to understand what I have to do right now. Let me close all the internal classes and let me go to my app config class. Here I will do the simple thing. I will not use the empty constructor. Here I need to pass a data source object. So let me create a method called data source and let me directly call it. So let me create a data source method. Okay, let me go ahead and create a method called data source. So let me go to the top and let me copy this method name, copy this and paste it over here, and this is the method I want to create. And obviously this is going to return a data source like this, and this is going to be a public method. So let me write public here, and obviously this is going to be a bean, and this is going to be a data source object I'll be creating. Okay, there is a data source object I have to create, and I have to return a data source object, right? So let me just write null to get rid of the error, but I have to return a data source object right over here, and this method I will be calling over here. So this method is going to return a data source object, and I think my JDBC template using this data source object right now can connect to the database. But yeah, so now the thing is that how to create the data source object right now, because if I'm going to click on this data source is a interface, right? So I cannot do data source is equal to new data source, right? If I'm going to be doing that, if I'm going to be creating the data source object in order to return that, can I just do data source is equal to new data source? Obviously, if you're going to be doing this, this is the interface method. You have to override all this method because data source has get connection method so that you can get the connection object and all these things. I don't want to give any implementation detail because I know this is the interface. So this is not a good idea to write the implementation, right? So can I go to the data source class one more time and let's just see if there is any default implementation is available over here. So if I'm going to be clicking on this icon, I have a lot of implementation I can see, but one implementation I can use called DriverManagerDatasource. This is a data source implementation class given by Spring that we as a programmer can use to test our different thing. But this is not a class that we should use for production, but for testing we can use it. For production, what we should use, I'll be telling you guys. But right now, let me just create a driver manager data source object, which is the implementation for this interface. So let me close this class. Let me go over here and let me just write driver manager data source, driver manager data source. And there you go. Okay, we have created the data source object. We'll be returning it over here. Now this method will be calling it inside the JDBC template. JDBC template will be using this data source object to connect to my database first. Then the JDBC template can use a method like execute to push data. But now the thing is, this data source, this is a simple object. This is just the object, right? But data source means what? What database you want to connect to, what is the URL, what is the username, what is the port number, and obviously what is the password, most importantly, the credential. If you're going to give that details to the data source, then only the connection can happen to the database, right? So let's just do that thing. So we're going to be doing this data source dot set username. Do we have that? Data source dot user. No. Driver manager data source. Can I use this reference right over here? So how to set the username? Maybe I'm not getting the option. Can I just copy and paste it over here directly? And can I just check this? Yeah, now I'm getting the option. Let's say set password. I have to set a password for my data source. I'll be setting a data source dot username of my DB. And also I will be setting, most importantly, data source dot URL, like the database URL that I want to connect to. Okay, so maybe here I'll be defining some variable like username. I'll be creating a variable like password, and I'll be creating a variable like let's say URL, right? Something like this. And all these variables are not available. So let me create all these variables right over here. Let me just write private string username and private string let's say password. And I can write private string, let's say URL. Let's say these are the three variables. Right now I have to initialize the data for them. I won't be initializing it by myself. I have already defined those details over here inside this properties. I can keep on reading them, right? So how can I read all these properties? This keys has values right over here, right? So I need to read the key details that I have over here. So how can I do that? I can come over here and let me just keep on loading their values. So I can just write value and I can give their details right over here. So can I go to the properties for the username? For the username, this is the key. Copy that. Dynamically, I'll be reading the value over here. Paste it. And can I copy this value and paste it over here as well? And I'll be pasting it over here as well, right? So that's good. So I have username, password, and URL. So now this, I will change this like, password, and I'll also change it like URL just to match all the keys that I have in my properties file. So all these three things will be read by this variables, and now this variable will be injected with the values by loading it from the properties file, and I'll be using them to create my data source object right over here. All this variable will be used over here, and then I'll be creating my JDBC template using the data source returned by this particular method. So I think I should be good right now. So can I go to the main application? And now I feel if I will be injecting a new record right over here, let's say Praveen in India, if I'm going to be injecting this record, I hope that this JDBC template right now will be created, because internally it needs a data source. That object also I'm creating. I'm also printing my data source details over here just to make sure that the object I am injecting over here, the object I'm creating over here is a driver manager data source. Let's see that those details are also getting printed over here or not. Okay, let me just run this application. Let's see right now if you are having any issues. Okay. So there you go. Looks like the data is inserted in the table. First of all, congratulations, because all these things has been done by us. Spring Boot has no role over here. The configuration is done by the developer only. So let me just reload the data from here. And if I'll be querying all my data right now, and there you go, we have the probe in record over here, which is number 4th. So that means our things are working fine over here. We are able to insert the data over here, and let's look at the console. Look at the data source object that we are printing over here. That's called DriverManagerDatasource. Obviously, this is the object that we have created over here, and this is the object that we are printing over here, right? Right now, this is not Hikari data source. This is the DriverManagerDatasource, because Hikari data source is the default data source created by Spring Boot. Right now, I'm doing my configuration, so I'm using this class, and this is the connection in the driver class connection information. Even you want to print the connection object right now, you can just do one thing. You can just do data source dot get connection, and let's say I'm just writing data source connection in the log. So if I'll be running this, obviously this will give me the problem again. Let's say prob in new. Okay, I'm changing the data and I'm rerunning my code. You're gonna be seeing the connection details over here. Let's just see that. Okay, you can see right now the connection info, it is coming from com.mysql.cj.jdbc, because we are using a MySQL driver, and this data source that we are using, this data source, for the implementation of the data source we are using is DriverManagerDatasource, which is going to give us a plain raw connection object of MySQL database, and that's why this is the connection we are using to connect to the DB, which is used by Spring JDBC behind the scene. I hope that much is making sense. But right now, the next thing is the data source that we are using. This is not good. This is just for development purpose. Even if you're gonna go to the documentation of DriverManagerDatasource, you're gonna be finding it is clearly written. Like if you're gonna get the map and source, if you can try to get the map and source, you can go inside this class and you can check the details, right? Because this is purely for development purpose. You should not be using this data source in real time. Now the question is, why we should not use this data source in real time, and why Spring used to use the Hikari data source, and why you as a developer, what you want to use? You want to use something like this class, or you want to go for a connection pooling concept? Yeah. This brings up a new concept called connection pooling. Let's just understand what it does behind the scene, that connection pooling stuff, how it helps us in real time. I'll be telling you guys about that right now. But yeah, before going for that, you can hear out some noises here. It's raining really heavy outside. So if you are hearing some crazy raining noise, enjoy it. Raining noise is pretty relaxing, and I'm recording this on a Saturday. I'm completely relaxed. It's just started to getting a little bit chill over here because the October month is started, and yeah, so the crazy rain in the winter is really helping me to chill out even more. Okay, so let's not get more chilled, rather than let's just go for connection pooling. What it is, let's just give me a very basic overview on that. Let's just go to my whiteboard so that I can draw something and can show you something. Okay, let me tell you in very term, like what's going on behind the scene right now. So we are using DriverManagerDatasource. So what it does, let's say this is our Spring Boot app, right? This is our Spring Boot app, Spring app, right? Now we have our DB over here, right? I told you to make a connection to this DB, we need the data source, okay? So in our application, we have a data source which is helping us to make this connection. Cool. Okay. So inside this data source, we have the connection object, right? Data source wrapped up the connection object. So the connection object that you have, it is coming inside the data source. You can think like data source is a wrapper. Okay. Coming back, the DriverManagerDatasource, you know what? Let's say there is a request is coming to your application. So what it is doing, it is directly hitting to the database every time. Let's say one request is coming, okay? It is doing some query, like, get me all the students, okay? So what it will do, it will hit the database and create a connection, because obviously it want to fetch some data, right? So it need to connect to the DB first. Let's say you want to modify a student details, then a request will come, like you will be requesting to the application that, okay, modify the student details, here is the student details. So now your application will do the modification in the database, so it will connect to the database, a connection object is required, so the data source will do what? So the data source is going to hit the database every time to create a connection object, right? So the connection object will be created like this, and it will be giving you one connection object whenever you will be requesting to do some alteration of data using your application, obviously on the database, right? So for any kind of modification, a new connection object is going to be created by this data source. And right now this data source we're using is the DriverManagerDatasource. That is the culprit, and this is not a good thing to do, because every time I want to do some operation in the database, I need to hit the database, I need to create a connection object. And creating a connection is a very costly operation. Like, you need to connect to the database, you need to open the socket, you have to authenticate by giving your credential, and then you will be creating the connection object. You have to close the socket, you'll get the connection object, and then you'll do the operation. So every time if I want to perform some operation, if my application need to connect to the database, and every time the application has to create a new connection to connect to the database, that is not a good approach. And that is the exact thing the driver manager data source that we are using to create our create our connection object. That thing is doing the exact same thing, and that's what we want to avoid. This guy, driver manager data source, this is what it does behind the scene. That's why we will avoid it. So if you want to avoid it, then how to create the data source connection? Because data source is a interface, we have to give a implementation. That's why we have given the driver manager data source implementation. Okay, now to give the implementation, we can take help of some connection pooling vendor. And what do you mean by connection pooling? The term only saying you everything, right? Connection pooling, a pool of connection, right? Instead of creating a connection by hitting the database again and again whenever you are trying to modify or alter, or you want to do any kind of operation in the DB, rather than when you are starting the server, create a pool of connection so that you don't have to create the connection again and again every time you want to do some DB operation. It works like in this way. For an example, let me go to my annotator one more time. Imagine this is your DB, okay, and this is your application. This is your app, right? Now your app is deployed inside a server, let's say a Tomcat server, right? So whenever your server is starting, you're going to be having a bunch of connection object during the startup only. So you don't have to hit the database every time to create connection whenever you need to perform any DB operation. Rather, when you are launching your application, you will be creating some connections like this, right? So what will happen? Let's say you are making a request. Somebody is making a request that, hey application, I want to do some insert operation to my student table. So what your application will do, okay, you want to do some operation, so I will connect to the DB. But to connect to the DB, I'll be needing a connection object. So first of all, I'll hit the DB and I'll create the connection first. Then I will hit again to insert the record to the DB. But here in this case, what will happen? One connection object it will borrow from the pool, because this is what we call a connection pooling or a CP. So one connection will be borrowing from here, and using that connection we'll be making a call to DB, right? And it's only one hit to the database, right? That, okay, I want to perform this operation, my job is performing the insert operation, that's what I'll be doing straight away. Before this call, I don't have to make another call to create a connection. That call is not needed right now. And once the work is done over here, once you make the modification over here, once the data is inserted, once your DB responding you back, this connection object that you have taken over here, it will again go back to the pool and it will stay again over here. Another person is making a request to the application to do some modification. Let's say he want to update the student detail, or you want to do something else. Then your application will take another connection object, or maybe it can take the same connection object if it is available. So what I mean to say, there are limited number of connections that you have created. Let's say 20 connection you have created, 20 connection object that you have created during your server startup, right? And every time you are making a call, you can borrow one connection, and you will be using that connection to make a call. Once that connection work is over, that connection will go back to the pool again. And then again you are making some request, one connection you can borrow, or same connection if it is free, you can borrow that and you can use it to make a call to the DB. So we are not creating connection objects again and again. We have some fixed number of connections we are using. And to create this kind of pool, there are a lot of vendors with they are available, and they will give you they are ready-made code to create the connection pooling. There are connection pooling vendor like Hikari. We have Hikari connection pool. We have C3P0 or C3PO connection pooling vendor. We have DBCP. This is also an API you can use, DBCP2. We also have Tomcat connection pooling. We have MySQL connection pooling. We have Oracle connection pooling. We have different API provided by different vendor to create this connection pooling feature, so that you don't have to create connection every time you hit the database. Rather, whenever you are starting your server itself, you're going to be having a bunch of connections, and those connections are already created. So whenever you are making a call, you'll be borrowing one connection object and you'll be making the call. There is no need to make a call first, create the connection, and then establish the connection and then making the actual call to perform the operation. That is not required. Okay, I hope this much of information is making sense. If you are in my paid repository, by the way, there are some connection pooling related videos available. Just watch them out. If you're watching it for free on YouTube, no need, right? With this information, we can proceed further. So right now, this Hikari connection pooling is the default implementation of the Spring Boot. Okay, let's say right now, I know it is the default implementation. Let's say I don't want to use Hikari connection pooling. Rather, let's say I will use some other connection pooling vendor just for fun. Let's say I do not want to use the DriverManagerDatasource right now to create the connection. Rather, I'll go to Maven repository. Okay, and inside this, I look for something called C3P0. Go for this. Okay, this is a connection pooling vendor. As I said, DBCP2, Tomcat, C3P0, Hikari. C3P0 is also one type of connection pooling, right? Let's say I want to use this right now. So I'll be copying all this dependence. I'll be going back to my IntelliJ and I will go to my project. I'll go to my dependency first, and I'll grab this dependency and I'll paste it over here so that I'll get the feature of C3P0, right? I'll just do a Control S, and I'll also make sure I will update my Maven project, right? So let me put it in sync so that I'll get that feature in. Okay, and now what I can do, I can use C3P0 in my application. So right now, if I'll come to my app config, if I'll expand this off, I do not want to use the DriverManagerDatasource. Rather, I will use C3P0. I think it's called not C3P0 data source. It's called combo pooled, if I'm not wrong. Combo pooled. You can see this combo pooled data source. Let me change all this, DriverManagerDatasource to combo pooled data source. Now this guy will help me to create a connection pool behind the scene, right? And this guy will not going to hit our database again and again for a connection. So when the server starts, it is going to help us to create a pool. And to do that, to this data source, we have to set the username and the URL property. I think they have a different method to set the username. I think it is set user or something. Yeah, set user. For the URL, maybe it is set JDBC URL. And there you go. Now there will be a connection pooling will be created for you. There is a connection pool will be created for you. Now with that connection pool, with this much of thing, there are a lot of other things also will be configured, like how long a connection will be valid, when the timeout will happen, how much time a connection will stay ideal in the pool, a lot of different properties like that. Connection pooling is a separate topic, don't want to go with that, but I want to show you something right now. I have already changed this particular line, so right now the DriverManagerDatasource at least will not be used. So let me just do a Control S, and let me go to my main application and let me run my application with some different data. Let's say some different data over here, some different ID, and let me see that whether my application is up and running and whether my JDBC template is using the connection pool behind the scene and things are working fine. And you can see there are a lot of good things are over here. First of all, data is inserted. So I should see Rakesh in my database. So if I'm going to do a query, there you go, it is Rakesh new, the ID is 10. And also, if you're going to see the data source connection right now that we are printing over here by writing this get connection thing, you can see it is right now giving you a connection impl, that's a MySQL connection, but it is wrapped up under this class called new proxy connection, which is coming from C3PO impulse. So this is the connection object that you are using right now, and this connection object we are getting from the pool. This is not the direct connection object. And here is the info printed by Spring Boot. You can see it is initializing the C3 pool right now, and see the combo pool data source that we have created right now over here by this line, and we have only set this much of properties, but a lot of things has been created by default right over here. You can see there is some properties like acquire increment, checkout time, initial pool size, like when the connection pool will be created, how many connection will be there, then let's say max ideal time over here, how much time the connection will stay active. Lot of different properties has been set over here, and as I said, we don't have to understand these properties right now because it's a separate topic. So with all these properties, a few connection has been created in the pool. Okay, so we can reutilize those pool again and again for different connection we'll be making to our database right now, instead of creating a connection, a fresh new connection every time using the driver manager data source, because that is going to be a costly operation. We have replaced it with the combo pool data source. Okay, and also our things are working good. So with this much of information, we have understood three major part. JDBC template, we're using it to make calls. Data source, we're using it to make connection. Connection pooling, we're using it to create a connection pool for the server. And if you're going to see the exact same thing also done by Spring Boot behind the scene, whenever we are not doing all this configuration. For an example right now, what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be removing my app config class. I can just comment out this configuration, so nothing will be useful right now. This class will not be scanned itself, and all these beans also will not be created, right? So this class is useless, where we have created all our data source and our JDBC templates. Let's not use it right now. We understand right now how all these things works. So what we'll do, we'll go back to our main class right now, and let's just run our class. And I'm sure right now it is going to fail, because here we are making JDBC template, we're using it, and this is not going to be created right now. I can see JDBC template is not created. It is asking us to define it inside the configuration, and there is error over here, right? So right now, let's just understand, like, how Spring is working with how the Spring Boot is working. So let me remove this exclude part right now, and let's just see like how these classes are working right now and what is happening behind the scene. Okay, now let me just start with Spring Boot. All the default configuration, I have only specified the connection properties over here, which will be read by Spring Boot, and let's just start default, and you can see I think this is happening because there is a duplicate entry is present right now. Let me just make it 11 or something. Things will work fine. Let me just rerun it. You will see that everything is working smoothly, and all the implementation is default. Now let's just try to understand it. See, first of all, the connection object that we are printing, this connection object is wrapped off under the Hikari proxy connection, because the connection that we are getting is a Hikari connection pool connection, right? So by default, Spring Boot is using Hikari connection pool because it is also a beast. It is beast in performance. Okay, so we understood everything right now, and here comes the fun part, like how everything is happening behind the scene by Spring Boot when we as a developer don't define anything. Spring Boot is doing a lot of auto configuration for us, right? 1 second. Okay, I'm thirsty. Okay. All right, so how everything is happening behind the scene. So we have this particular project called Spring Data JDBC internals. If I'll go to our main application, so right now I have commented out everything, my own custom auto configuration, the data source, the JDBC template, I have commented it out. So I'll go to the Java folder, and if I'll go to this Spring Data JDBC internal application, from here the magic is beginning. So this is the main application, and this is annotated as Spring Boot application. At the rate Spring Boot application does have an embedded annotation which is called enable auto configuration. You guys know about it, right? So what does the enable auto configuration does? So the enable auto configuration load all the auto configuration defined on the properties file. So there is not a properties file, there is a file available inside the auto configuration package. If you're going to go to the internal folders that we have by looking into your map and directory, we should have this auto configure dependency pulled in automatically for activating the auto configuration feature of Spring Boot. If you'll go inside this, if you're going to go inside the meta inf, if you're going to go inside the Spring folder, we have this file, right? And you guys know that org.springframework.boot.autoconfigure.autoconfiguration.imports. Oh, that's a big name. So inside this file, we have all our, like you can see, all our dependencies has been specified over here. But the one that we are looking for is a JDBC template auto configuration and the data source auto configuration. So these two files are also going to be triggered automatically because we have that @enable auto configuration embedded with Spring Boot application. If I'm going to hover on this, it is already having the @enable auto configuration. So this file is going to trigger. Okay, so first thing is the data source auto configuration, because you know that data source auto configuration is going to configure the data source for us. So if I'm gonna do a shift and open this particular data source auto configuration file. So first of all, this file will be triggering or not. Obviously this file will be triggering. How I'm confident? Because look at the conditional on class. That means when these two classes are present inside the class path, then obviously this particular class is going to be a trigger. And if you're going to look into the data source, we already have this class over here. And if you're going to do this thing, if you're going to do link it to the editor, you can see the data source class is already present inside the java.sql package. This might be pulled in by the dependency that we have added for Spring JDBC. And if you're going to see over here, so this is already a part of Java 19. We don't even need to have a dependency to get access to this class. This is a interface which is available with the Java only. So it is already inside the class path. And the other class that we have inside the conditional on annotation, embedded database type, it is also available. If you're gonna do link to editor, it is already there inside the embedded folder. And this is also inside the JDBC dependency has pulled it in. You can see it over here. So these two classes are already available. So cool. So data source auto configuration is going to trigger. And once this auto configuration class is going to trigger, that means this class is going to load and will do its work. What work it is going to do? It is going to create the data source for us. So if you're going to come to a little down, no need to watch all this code, just understand. There is something we should be having a pooled data source configuration. You can see there is a static class, right? And inside the static class, basically we are basically creating a data source object. So where we are creating the data source object, right? Can you see any data source, data source object over here? There is a bean present over here, but this bean is returning properties JDBC connection details. So no, we don't need that bean. I'm looking for that bean which is creating the data source internally. So the pool data source configuration is going to help you to create a connection pool type of data source. Well, to create a connection pool, we can create a connection pool using C3P0, the way I have shown you. We can create a connection pool by using the Tomcat connection pool itself. We can create a connection pool by using Hikari. We can create a connection pool by using DBCP. We can also create a connection pool by using Oracle. There are lots of vendors, right? And based on our choice, we can start on creating different connection pooling, data source. So we just need to keep that dependency, and automatically the data source of that connection pool vendor will be created, right? I think C3P0 is not by default supported. That's why we have to create the connection pooling by ourselves, the when we practiced it. But if you're going to go for Hikari or DBCP, I think just keep the dependency and the pool will be created for you, right? So how all those configuration happens? For an example, here I have not done anything by myself. The Hikari connection pooling, I have not created, but how it is getting created? Because of this class. So if you're going to see this class, it is loading all the configuration using this @import annotation. And you can see it is loading it using all these classes. There is a Hikari class present. There is a Tomcat class present. There is a DBCP2 class present. there is a Oracle class present, there is some generic something is present. So all these classes that we have, these are all inner classes. I feel we have one class called DataSourceAutoConfiguration, and inside that all these classes are there. Let's just see. So okay, right now again to repeat, I'm inside which class? I'm inside the DataSourceAutoConfiguration class. What it does, create a data source for me automatically. Okay, so which method does that? No need to remember, I'm just repeating it. That method is pull data source configuration. But here there is no bean is getting created which returns a data source. We have only one bean, this returns something else, right? So I will go to the import annotation, and over here you can see there is a Hikari class present. You go inside it, right? Now look at this. This is your Hikari class, and right now you can see the bean defines here. There are two beans. I just want to see the bean which returns a data source, and you can see this bean. There is a bean defined here inside this class Hikari, and it returns what? It returns a data source object, and there goes the data source, right? Hikari data source. If you're going to go into this, this is going to implement the data source, right? So if you're going to go to the data source, if you're going to click on this annotation, you are going to see Hikari data source is the implementation. You can see Hikari data source is the implementation, right? Previously we have used combo pull data source, right? So see, combo pull data source we have used previously, which is also an implementation. So we have that internal support of Hikari. Let's just go back to the Hikari class. Okay, Hikari data source, go back. Yeah, we come back to the Hikari class. Inside the Hikari, we have this Hikari data source, which is going to return us a Hikari data source object. You can see it is creating a Hikari data source object by using some create data source method. We don't have to understand how it is creating. We just know that it is returning that, and this is the data source object which is internally getting created. So that's what we have seen at that time. Whenever we are asking for any object, Spring Boot was giving us a Hikari data source object, and this is the data source we are creating over here. Okay, so you can ask me, okay, Vilas, so when this Hikari class will be fired, how it is getting fired automatically? So it is automatically getting triggering, because look at that. So if you're going to see this class data source configuration, if you're going to see this class, so this is basically getting used by your data source auto configuration class, right? I told you, no, data source auto configuration, it has that method called pull data source configuration, and it is importing the properties from different types of connection pulling class. So I clicked on Hikari. But if you're going to look over here, the same class does have a lot of other inner classes. You can see you have a static class for DBCP2, which returns the, you can see it is returning some data source, which is basic data source. Like we have combo pull data source for C3P0 connection pooling provider, Hikari data source for Hikari connection pooling provider. Like for DBCP2 vendor, the class is basic data source, which is going to help us to create a data source object. And like that, if you're going to go up, you are also going to have Oracle UCP. You have a lot of different, connection pooling vendor is provided over here by Spring Boot. But Spring Boot is by default is choosing Hikari over here. Why is that? Look at this class Hikari. This is a class. And when this class is going to trigger, look at this. There is a conditional on annotation, and it is saying when Hikari data source is present inside the class path, then only trigger this class. And obviously, as I have shown you, Hikari data source, if you're going to click on this Hikari data source, which is inside the conditional on class, click on this, this is present inside the class path. You can already see, it is already there inside this particular dependency. So it is already there inside the Hikari CP. There is a, Hikari CP is it's already available inside our class path. And that's why Hikari data source is already there in my class path. That's why that Hikari data source is it is basically triggering. So how you can say Hikari CP, we have not added it to our class path. So how it is there? Because if you're going to see in our Maven, let me just collapse everything. If you're going to see our project in the pom.xml file, whenever we have added that dependency, right? Spring Boot starter JDBC dependency, inside over here, we also have this Hikari CP. Look at this, right? The Hikari CP dependency is already there. So Hikari CP dependency, we don't have to add. It's already there inside our class path. So that's why if I'm gonna close all the classes right now, just to make sure that we all are in the same page. So let's just close all the tab. Right now, if I'm gonna go to do a shift and search for DataSourceAutoConfiguration, inside this DataSourceAutoConfiguration, if you're gonna go to that method is pull DataSourceConfiguration. We have the Hikari configuration over here. Inside this Hikari configuration, so we already have the conditional on class Hikari DataSource, which is present inside the class path. That's why this Hikari one is automatically getting triggered, and automatically this bean is getting created, which is returning us a Hikari DataSource. And also you can see there is another annotation here, conditional on missing bean. That means there should not be any bean for data source already present inside the application context. Right now, as a developer, I am not creating any bean. If you're gonna see over here, the source main Java, the bean that we have created before for the data source, this is not available because we have removed the add configuration annotation. So Spring is not going to create this bean right now. Even this class we are not using, you can delete it directly. But that's why if you're going to come to the data source configuration class, so conditional on missing bean is also present inside the Hikari. It is confirming that the developer has not created any bean for data source, and that is the condition which is matched. And also there should be the Hikari data source present inside the class path, that is also matching. That's why this auto configuration is triggering, and it is creating me this data source object over here. But how it is creating the data source? To create the data source, we need the URL, username, password, and all these things, right? And those are the things we have defined over where we have defined it inside the resources folder, right here, username, password, URL. So all these things we are setting over here. So how our Hikari data source is reading all these things? So basically, if you're gonna go to this data source configuration to the Hikari class inside it, we have the data source. It is getting created over here. Look at this, the properties it is reading. It is basically getting all the properties from here, data source properties, and using this property it is basically creating the data source. And what is this properties are all about? So inside, when Hikari is creating the data source, it is using the data source properties class. And if you want to look at this class, this is the class where we have all this variable, username, password, URL, and all this variable we have set over here, right? If you're gonna go to our application.properties file, we set everything over here, username, password, URL. By writing all this thing, we are basically accessing those variables and setting those variable details. How we are setting those variable details? By accessing those variables by using this prefix spring.datasource, right? So if you want to go to that class called DataSource properties, which is holding URL, username, password, if you're going to scroll off, you're going to be seeing the configuration properties over here, which is basically having a prefix called spring datasource. So spring.datasource, you can just do .username, spring.datasource.password, spring.datasource.url. Like this you can access, right? And this is the same thing you are doing inside the application properties file. So all these variables that we have inside the class right now, you are initializing and setting values to this. And if you're going to go to our data source configuration class, where our Hikari class present, where Hikari is creating the data source, it is using all these things in the parameter and getting the data from there, like all the data. Like we don't have to care about the internal code. Only the thing that we have to understand that it is using these properties to create the data source, right? So the data source thing is taken care by the Hikari guy, right? And Hikari is the one which is getting triggered because we have that dependency, right? Which is good. So the next thing, now our data source related thing is done. Let me just close all the file and classes. So data source auto configuration, we know what it is doing. We know what this class is doing. It is creating the data source. The next thing, if I'm going to close it, okay, I have to open that configuration auto configuration file again. So I have to go to the Maven and I have to go to the auto configure package again. We have to find the another dependency, another auto configuration class. Apart from the data source auto configuration, we have the JDbcTemplate auto configuration. Now if you're going to be shift this and open this class, you're going to be finding that okay, inside this JDBC auto configuration class, this is going to help us to create the JDBC template object, right? Because we are not creating it, so Spring will be creating it. So JDBC template auto configuration class. Obviously there is no code inside it, but it is importing the property from this class, JDBC template configuration. If you go inside this, you can see like, they have this bean over here, JDBC template object they are creating and returning it. This is a bean, and you can see they're creating the object here and by taking the data source. And this data source is what right now? This data source is the Hikari data source, because Spring Boot has by default chosen it. If you have created your own data source, this is the data source the JDBC template will be using. So JDBC template object is getting created over here, and the data source, like they are taking and they are returning the JDBC template object. And this is the JDBC template object which is given to us whenever we are asking for it. So we are asking for the JDBC template object right here, right? So this object is given by Spring Boot, because Spring Boot has created it, injected all the properties needed by the JDBC template object like data source, and now we are directly getting it and using it over here. But all those things was happening behind the scene, and obviously the JDBC template class will trigger, because if you have a doubt whether this class will trigger or not, look at the JDBC template auto configuration class. What is the conditional on class? Conditional on class is JDBC template class should be present in the class path, and the data source class should be present inside the class path. Obviously the JDBC template class is present inside my class path, because if you're going to do link to editor, because I have added the Spring JDBC dependency, right? And this is present in my class path, and the other one is the data source, and obviously this is coming by default in Java, as we have seen. So nothing to worry. All these things are getting configured by default. The connection pooling, the Hikari data source, the JDBC template, and all the auto configuration are triggering and helping us to configure everything on the go, right? I hope this makes a lot of sense to you guys right now, how the things happens behind the scene. If you feel this helps, just make sure to subscribe to the channel and to like this video if you think this helped you. Right? This is going to motivate me a lot to make more videos like this. I'll see you guys in the next video. So this is it. I don't want to do anything right now today, because it's already been an hour I'm recording all these things, and the rain is also gone, right? So watch my other videos and let me know in the comments if you have any questions. And guys who are the paid viewers of mine, in case you have access to my paid courses, about the connection pooling related videos, you can check it out. It is available inside the Spring and Hibernate bootcamp and in my Hibernate course. If you're going to be finding it out, right? You can just go and check those things right now if you are interested. Otherwise, this much is enough. But I think you should learn a little bit like how to create those connection pooling object. What are the different properties we have to set over there? Very important, right? And one more thing. I just want to tell you. So I told you now, guys, if you're gonna look for this, what is that? Data source auto configuration class, right? Data source auto configuration class. Look at this class, and I told you that this is basically having that Hikari connection pooling. It is creating right inside that pool data source configuration. It is loading everything from Hikari, right? So I also told you that inside this, it is going to create the data source, and it is going to look for all the properties that you set in the properties file. It is going to read it using this class, and it is going to load it. But one more thing you can see, whenever it is creating the data source, it is also loading some properties from this particular prefix, right? And this is also setting it to the connection pooling that it is creating. This is called Spring Data Source Hikari. It is reading from this properties as well, right? This bean is going to read all the properties from data source properties, which has those username, password, URL, those things that you are specifying. Plus, it is going to read from spring.datasource.hikari thing. So if you're going to copy this, and if you're going to go to your application.properties file, like this, one second, like this, and here, by putting this thing, you can also specify a lot of different Hikari related connection pooling settings. You can set like how long, like when the server is booting up, how many objects, the connection objects you want to create, what is the ideal wait time, when the connection object should be timed out, lot of different things you can specify. You can just give all those properties and you can try setting all those variable over here. You can go to internet and look for those things in the Hikari documentation. But if let's say you are saying that I want 10 object or 15 object or 50 object to be created, 50 connection object to be created when the Hikari connection pooling is going to be bootstrapped, then those information you can just put by writing writing the property name over here, and all those things that you'll be configuring over here in your class, that will be loaded by this data source. Those values will be loaded over here. Okay, so if, like, by default Hikari connection pool have some default value, but you can actually override it just the way I have shown it for your combo pool data source, right? Just do some more research about it as well if you like it, and I hope that will help you for your future as well. So this is it. I think I spoke pretty much. Bye bye. Happy coding. Tata.